Catch your eye. Good morning. I am Carol Card.
And I'm Margaret Linton. Welcome to the First Unitarian Congregation of Ottawa and our Green Goodbyes event, which is part of the Adult Learning and Growth Offerings. We will begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that our campus is located on traditional, unsurrendered, and unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, and that the work of reconciliation is a responsibility of our congregation and of all Canadians.
We are pleased to have 3 presentations for you, followed by a short question and answer period. There is also a table at the back with various information that you can look at or take with you. First of all, we're going to hear a short personal perspective from Anne Orfald, who is one of our congregation members and has given this issue quite a bit of thought.
Good morning. It's good to be here. And I want to start by saying thank you to the Adult Learning and Growth team for providing this program today on alternatives to cremation and standard burial. A while back, when I decided it was time to become a member of this congregation, I filled out my application, and then I got a call from Carol. Because of COVID, we spoke over the phone. We had a wonderful conversation, and in the midst of that, she asked me about my interests. And one of the things I mentioned was that I'd recently become interested in natural burial, or as some people call it, green burial. She said, I'm interested in that too. And the next thing I knew, there was a small group that had pulled together to create this event today. And they contacted various agencies and services, and here we are. We don't often talk about these things, excuse me, but when we do say to someone, what do you think happens when we die? We're often thinking in terms of what happens to the spirit or the life force, but that's not what we're talking about today. Today it's about what happens to our body, and that's something we have choices about. I remember back when my grandparents died, they were embalmed and they were displayed before the funeral and then buried in a cemetery. A generation later, conventions had changed, and my parents were cremated. Their ashes went into the family plot. My parents-in-law were cremated. Their ashes got sprinkled on water that was important to them. And then a few years ago, when my husband died, he was also cremated, and we sprinkled his ashes on Lake Kashwakamak, which is where our cottage is. I then have recently been thinking about what it would mean to be cremated, because until recently I assumed that's what would happen. But I've worried, because of my interest in environmental issues, about the amount of energy that it takes to burn a body. And I've worried about the emissions from cremation. And I've thought, well, how much benefit is there left in those ashes when they're returned to the earth or scattered on the waters? So I have chosen to be buried as simply as possible in a manner that feeds the earth as it has fed me. The other thing about today is I'd like to be able to talk about these issues more comfortably with people, and I hope that will happen. So today I really want to thank Carol and Margaret and Jane and others that may have helped, and the speakers that are going to be here in person and those online. And I'm looking forward to this session. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry about my voice.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce Judith Wook. Judith Wook was president of the Funeral Information Society of Ottawa and is now vice chair and chair of the Natural Burial and Alternative Disposition Committee of the Funeral Advisory and Memorial Society of Ontario. She is also a member of Conservation Burial Ottawa. Welcome, Judith.
Thank you. It's interesting, when I first started working in this field, volunteering in this field some 10, 15 years ago, and people would ask what I did, and I would say I'm interested in bringing green burials to Ottawa, and they would either say, "What's that?" or they would say, "Isn't it a beautiful day outside?" And now, when I say I'm interested in bringing green burials to Ottawa, people say, "Oh, tell me more about it. I'm interested in that for myself, too." So the attitudes have really changed in the last 10 years or so. A little bit about the history. Caring for our dead is one of the essentially human traits, and there are Paleolithic graves of our ancestors in which they are clearly arranged in a fetal position and covered with red ochre, and so it was clearly an intentional burial. And in the 19th century, which was in the West, was mainly a rural society, and the dead people would be laid out in the parlor, which was the ceremonial center of the house, and that's why even today we still call the commercial establishment funeral parlors. But then as industrialization took hold in the 20th century, and a lot of things moved from the home, the cottage industry, to the commercial sphere. That happened with the death industry as well, and so the whole range of funeral homes and services were commercialized and taken out of the home, and the dead were, the cycle of life and death was no longer visible in the home, though the body was taken out to a separate place where it was displayed. And somewhere in around the 1950s, an American woman named Jessica Mitford wrote a book about how expensive funerals were becoming. And in reaction to that, a group of Unitarians got together and started memorial societies. And the purpose of a memorial society was to promote dignified funerals that were not overly expensive, and to do advocacy for simple burials, a simple disposition in the legal realm and in the personal realm. And the Ottawa group was the Funeral Information Society of Ottawa. The groups in Ontario have now all been consolidated into one, which is the Funeral Advisory and Memorial Society, We do advocacy with the provincial government. We talk about the importance of planning beforehand, what you want for yourself, as I think it was very ably mentioned just now. And we have a consumer orientation. A funeral in Ontario can be $5,000 or more, just a very simple funeral. But as she said, it's really important to bring death as a part of life back into our conversation. One of the things that FAMS does is we're putting together an industry guide to funeral services. It's required in the legislation to put the cost of a funeral, the cost of their services on the website of every funeral home and cemetery. So most of them do that, but often you have to tell them why you want it. You have to identify yourself and give a lot of information about yourself before they'll give the information to you. And so that's something that we're hoping to be able to counter. We also do webinars, and I'm going to mention this again. We have one coming up tomorrow on monuments, on tombstones, and buying a tombstone in Ontario. So let me give you, there's a number of different definitions of green burial or natural burial. The words are used interchangeably. Some people prefer one, some prefer the other, and generally, actually, I usually use both. It is a funeral or a burial that expresses your values. If you want to give back to the earth, if you have a conservation orientation during lifetime, to be able to continue that after death. And so it's a way of caring for the death with minimal environmental impact. Very often, as I said, the definitions are not all standardized yet, but they will often include no embalming. It's substituted by refrigeration or by various kinds of disinfectants, because embalming is very poisonous to the earth. It usually includes direct earth burial with a shroud that's made of natural fibers, or a box, a coffin, or a casket that's made of some biodegradable substance, wood or grasses or bamboo. And also no need for a grave liner or a vault. The third is some kind of ecological restoration and conservation. Indigenous species of grasses and flowering plants and shrubs and trees that would, so that the space looks natural. It's not rows of stones. The one in Coburg, which is the oldest one in Ontario, has boulders sort of scattered around the field. And if you look at them closely, it'll have a name on them. But when you just look at it from a distance, it just looks like a field with stones in it. And very minimal infrastructure. The regulator in Ontario is called the Bereavement Authority of Ontario, and there are some books from them. They have very good information service. And one of the things that is important to note is what's the difference between what is provincial regulation and what is required by the cemetery itself. And the use of caskets and whether you can be buried in a shroud is actually not a provincial rule. It is and also embalming actually are not provincial rules. They are rules of the cemetery. And so if you were choosing a cemetery for yourself or for somebody, look at their constitution, at their regs, and see what is required, and see what's required also in relation to a tombstone or a monument. So if you want to, one of the most expensive parts of a funeral is the casket, and it is often very elaborate, and they'll try to upsell you and say, don't you want to show that you loved whoever it was, your loved one, and have this very elaborate casket. Actually, you can buy your own, or you can make your own, and it can be made of cardboard. You need to, you don't need a box at all, although you do need some kind of plank underneath or something, because just in order to carry the body. Okay. I was going to talk about possible options, but I think that Kelly's going to do that. As we move forward, what things do we need to do? Ontario has, and I'm talking only about Ontario, so if you live on the Quebec side, the rules are really quite different. For Ontario, there is the highest fee in the country for what's called the care and maintenance fee. And because there is a need for perpetual care of the cemetery. And so that it's hundreds of thousands of dollars to start a new cemetery because of this fee. And one of the issues is that a green cemetery, a natural cemetery, is a lot less, there's a lot less maintenance needed. You don't mow the lawn every week. And the actual maintenance is a lot easier because you don't have the rows of stones. And so one of the advocacy initiatives is to try to get that fee lowered for setting up a natural cemetery. There are a number of ways of encouraging the development of a green or natural burial ground in Ontario or anywhere, I guess. One of them is to negotiate with a existing cemetery and to see if they have a space for a green section. Another way is to find land. Either sometimes a farmer will donate land. That happened in BC with the only standalone cemetery, the natural cemetery, and or a land trust of some sort, because one of the things about cemeteries in North America is that they last forever. And so if you want your land to be natural forever and never have to be developed, turn it into a cemetery. And that's one of the things that we're looking at. I made up a resource list. There's some copies of it in the back there. But just to tell you, besides FAMS, which is the organization that I'm here today on behalf of, the Bereavement Authority of Ontario, I already mentioned them. They're the provincial regulator. There's Community Death Care Ottawa and Conservation Burial Ottawa that Kelly will be talking about. There's the Funeral Cooperative of Ottawa, and there's some information for them in the back there. They are a cooperative, which means that it's owned by the members, and they're bilingual. Actually, I didn't put the bilingual name into the sheet, but everything is totally bilingual, and they're operate as a nonprofit, and they have informational webinars for members, and it's a one fee to join, and then you're a member for a lifetime. And they are a funeral home, and they work with various cemeteries. They don't have their own cemetery. There's the Green Burial Council, which is American. Green Burial Ottawa Valley, which is a group of people that were set up to establish green burial sites in this area, and they actually now have several in the Ottawa Valley, and I think Kelly's going to talk to you more about that. The Natural Burial Association, which is Ontario, and the American one, which is called the Green Burial Council. And all of these sites have information on them. And actually, a lot of the funeral homes also have really good information on them about setting up a funeral. There's also the option of donating to a medical school, but that's a whole lot less useful nowadays for the medical school, because they can do a lot of things virtually, and so they don't need to have real cadavers to work on as much as they used to, because they now have computer programs that can simulate them. And something that doesn't come up very often, and that is to do research, forensic research. There is what's called a body farm in Quebec, outside Trois-Rivières, where they do research for forensic purposes. So if a body is found, they have donated bodies where they can try to simulate the conditions and see if they can discern, how long it's been there, or what conditions under which the person died. So we're going to have a Q&A, and I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have. As I said, there is a webinar tomorrow at 1 o'clock, put on by the Funeral Advisory and Memorial Society, and it's for the general public. It's not just for members, and you can sign up by going to the website, which is on this sheet. The other thing is, if you have any questions about Jewish funerals and burials, you can ask those of me as well. So thank you very much, and I'll be back in a bit.
Thank you very much, Judith. I will now introduce Kelly Butler, who is an educator, a thanatologist. I practiced that. I still didn't get it, and I'm sure you will explain the meaning a little further, and a member of Community Death Care Ottawa. She has over 30 years of experience in attending to the dying, the dead, and bereaved families. Her work focuses on the impacts of a death-denying culture and the importance of acknowledging our own mortality, particularly critical in this time of a climate crisis. So welcome, Kelly.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Margaret. Is the sound okay? Yeah? Okay, great, great. It's lovely to see you all here today. I wonder if, just by a show of hands, if you know someone or you yourself might someday be dead? So, yeah? Yeah. So it's a pretty common experience, and that's in part why we want to talk about this, because the decisions we make for end of life are consequential. We can, in our own individual decision making, have a tremendous impact. So, natural burial, I'm part of Community Death Care Ottawa. I talk about dying and death and grief quite a bit. And natural burial, as Judith mentioned, and as Anne alluded to, is an ever more, a topic that elicits a lot of curiosity. I think we're starting to think about, well, what impact do we have in those choices? And there are some really practical benefits, tangible benefits to choosing green burial. It is, as was already mentioned, a way of giving back to the earth. We offer ourselves back to nourish the soil that in turn feeds us. We often speak of the fact that death feeds life. We become part of that cycle, and we return to that cycle. It's an opportunity for beauty making. A natural burial site, because it's left in its natural state, we have wooded areas, meadows, and it can be a place that, we really want to visit, that we want to spend time in, versus the monoculture of, lawns and the monuments, the stones that are in the ground. And it's those cemeteries that are designed for the convenience of the maintenance, that we can, use a ride-on mower and be done with cutting the grass in no time. It, of course, reduces pollution because, we're not using a lot of the chemical inputs, the petrochemical inputs that traditional funerals, or conventional funerals, I should say, and conventional burial require. It's also a return to old ways, which was already mentioned this morning. We're going back to how, for millennia, we would have approached our dead. It's a way of protecting the land. Judith mentioned that already, that once a space is used as a cemetery, over time, sometimes this isn't perfectly true, but generally speaking, we hold that land in conservation. So if we are trying to create land conservancies, land conservation, designating it as a burial site is a great way to do that. Burial sites also tend to be, cemeteries in general, places of rich biodiversity. And this last summer, Community Death Care Ottawa organized a series of field trips where a local herbalist took groups of people to various cemeteries and just walked around identifying the incredible variety of plants that grow in those places. So it for people that are environmentally minded, natural burial is an excellent choice. I'm in favor of natural burial, but really the part that interests me most is the benefits to the humans that are left behind. How it tends to our grief, how it helps us in our bereavement. It gives us a sense of connection. Some of what's happened with death being moved out of the home and into the funeral industry, we've lost that sense of connection with our dead. We've outsourced the care. And so that sense of that relationship, of that bond being terminated is really difficult when we're grieving. Whereas if we can continue that relationship maintaining that sense of connection. It's a way of helping us in a very difficult moment. It again is carrying on with tradition. And ritual and tradition are ways of expressing ourselves in those moments when we just don't have words. We're so gutted, we're so heartbroken, and what can we even say? And we can turn to ceremony, we can turn to traditions and express ourselves in the ways that we've been taught by our religious traditions, by our family traditions, by our culture. Again, there is something in having participation, in having something to do. That also helps us in our time of grief. And I think we can imagine those moments when, you know, it's a stressful situation, you're maybe in the midst of a crisis, and you just want something to do. There's an energy in our body that needs somewhere to go. And natural burial often invites much greater participation than when, again, we are outsourcing care to a funeral home. This is a reclamation of our beloved dead. It's also a way of honoring our loved ones, and that too can be a comfort, because we're recognizing that, you know, this is what was really important to Mom, or, you know, my spouse just so loved, you know, going for walks, or, you know, was very careful in their life around being ecologically minded in thinking about what consequence they have as they walk through life. And now I can continue that by choosing on their behalf something that reflects those lived values. And that sense of doing right by someone also is a tremendous comfort to us when we're grieving. And the thing that I really appreciate about green burial or natural burial is that without needing to say it, without it needing to be spoken, it's an ongoing reminder that we walk on sacred ground, that the bones of our people are in the earth, and that this is, again, part of a beautiful sacred earth. And so it helps us to be remembering that truth, that I think when we, you know, sort of let our dead just, funeral home will deal with it, we're not involved, it becomes easy to sort of forget that this is one of the benefits of being present to death, even though it can be so challenging. We have a few slides. Again, we talk about green burial, natural burial a lot, and as Judith alluded to, there's been a lot of change in the last decade. And I'm really pleased about that. It's exciting to see that people are so responsive, that, you know, when we take a moment to think about, well, what is the impact? What are the consequences of these choices? That people respond really positively. This matters to us. We do want to do better. So when we think about disposition, I like to imagine that we really turn to the four elements. We ask the elements to take our dead from us. And that shows up in different ways. It can be by fire with cremation, very traditional in many cultures, growing in popularity in North America. In lots of places, it's well over half of dispositions or ways of dealing with the dead. Cremation is what's chosen. We have air, and you might think, well, what is that? But in some places, like Tibet, sky burials are how the dead are cared for, and they're offered up to the winged ones. We also, of course, have water, and that, you know, that could be burial at sea, or a very new option that you'll be hearing about, alkaline hydrolysis, otherwise known as aquamation, sometimes called water cremation. And then, of course, the earth. And I think for many of us, that would have been, you know, recognizing us as mostly, you know, Westerners, part of Western culture, this would have been what our people knew for millennia. This return to the earth, this feeding of the earth. And as I say, it's ever more something that people seem to be interested in. This unwillingness or this discomfort that people had in past talking about dying and death, we seem to be moving past that. And I think climate change is part of it, that we're recognizing that there are a lot of things we need to rethink. And so in having these conversations about natural burial, I thought, well, what we could do is talk about some of the options that are actually available and not just natural burial as a theory. So next slide, please. So we already have a few options in the area. Saint Redempteur is in Gatineau, and it's part of the Les Jardins de Souvenirs. Several cemeteries come under their purview. And so they have opened a natural burial section. It's an existing cemetery, and that's what you'll find with all of the natural burial sites in Ontario. They are existing cemeteries that have opened up a section that is devoted to natural burial. Now, one thing I'll mention is that, as Judith mentioned, we have the regulations that the BAO sets out, and then individual cemeteries have their own bylaws and regulations. In lots of places, you could have what is kind of a natural burial just by the choices that you make. You don't want embalming, you want a simple pine casket, and if you're at some, church cemetery, those would be allowed. There wouldn't be really much pushback. Natural burial takes it a little further in that you wouldn't be allowed to have a monument. You can pre-purchase a plot, but you can't pick a particular spot because they will fill in that land as people die. And the reason they do that is because then you leave that section undisturbed. And so it's sort of a chronological laying out of a cemetery rather than I've paid for this particular plot in this particular spot. So Les Jardins de Souvenirs, one example, and by 2025, all of their cemeteries will not allow any non-biodegradable material. So these changes are happening. Again, not every one of their cemeteries will have a specifically natural burial site, but we do have at Saint Redempteur, or the Holy Redeemer, that is available. They're also using, I know, any of the plants they're using, they're getting it from local sources, they're bringing them in from other cemeteries, they're using locally sourced stone. So these are some of the things that go into natural burial for this particular cemetery. Next slide. And then we have, I want to make sure I'm naming them in order, Loxley United Cemetery. This is in Pembroke. As Judith mentioned, Green Burial Ottawa Valley has, the work that they've done, they partnered with this cemetery. I think it's 2 years ago. They've had 2 natural burials already, at least at the site. Yes?
13 months ago.
13 months ago. Thank you, Mary.
We signed the Memorandum of Understanding on October 23rd last year.
Excellent. So that tells us, too, that, the demand is there, that as soon as this became available, people were choosing this as a form of disposition. And again, it's an existing cemetery, but they're now devoting part of the cemetery to natural burial. Next, we have Glenwood Cemetery. This is in Picton, so it's a little further, yes? Oh, Elmwood. Sorry, I almost forgot about Elmwood. Elmwood is in Perth.
That's where I'm going.
That's where you're going. Excellent. So I spoke to the fellow last week, and they are ready to go. They haven't started natural burial yet, but they are. This is something that I think it was 2 years ago they announced that they were working towards this. And like many things, there's steps. There are approvals that need to be made, changes to bylaws, but Elmwood Cemetery in Perth is also a site for natural burial. And so lastly, Glenwood Cemetery, are we there? That's in Picton. For a number of years, when people wanted green burial, this was the closest place they could go. And I mean, I dealt with a family just a month ago, they chose Glenwood Cemetery. I think because it's been established for a while, it's particularly beautiful. And this is part of the beauty making that I mentioned, that this is one of the things that we can do in choosing green burial for our dying, for our death. So Glenwood is, again, an existing cemetery, but it's been many years that they've had a natural burial site. And so this too, I wish I'd had time to go around to these other cemeteries that I named and take some pictures, because I don't know what stage they're at yet. It may still, you see from the photos, it may still look a lot like a conventional cemetery. But the last thing I wanted to share with you, next slide, and I can't tell you very much because it's still in the approval process, they're still going through the administrative work. But Ontario is about to have its very first dedicated natural burial site, and it's going to be in Ottawa. So change is happening. And I want to make it clear too that a lot of the reason this change is happening is because cemeteries and funeral homes are businesses, and they're responding to consumer demand. So if this is something you're thinking about, if you engage in pre-planning and you call around and you let people know, I say people, I mean, funeral homes and cemeteries, that this is what you're looking for, and if they can't provide it, you will take your business elsewhere. You will find that this change, the rate of change is going to pick up. I know I did a shrouding workshop a couple of months ago, and then within 2 weeks I had 3 calls from funeral homes saying, we've had somebody call and say they want a shrouded burial, and can you give us some more information? So it really makes a difference if you are letting the businesses know that this is going to be your choice for end of life. There are also many groups that are working on this, advocacy groups, as Judith mentioned. Green Burial Ottawa Valley's been at it for a while, and of course the Loxley Cemetery was the first really local cemetery that made this change. We have Green Burial Kingston, there's Anter Outaouais, and of course Conservation Burial Ottawa. And there's some cards at the back if you want to pick one up. Conservation Burial Ottawa is under the umbrella of Community Death Care Ottawa. And so along with natural burial, we do a lot of work around ways of engaging in the dying and the death. So home funeral demonstrations, shrouding workshops, and doing talks like this. That kind of advocacy work, even though we've already made some real strides, there's more to be done. I think one natural burial site in Ottawa is not enough. Ottawa is a very big city, and so our conservation burial group continues to look for other sites, unused, underused, or abandoned cemeteries. Andrian, maybe at the back later, we've got a map that one of the first things that Conservation Burial Ottawa did was look at, well, how many cemeteries are in Ottawa? And if you haven't already looked, how many cemeteries do you think there are in Ottawa? Just shout out a guess. 70, did I hear? Cemeteries in Ottawa. There's almost 100. Yeah, so that's it. It's surprising because a lot of these places are not really being used anymore, or they're small church cemeteries, and so there are opportunities there as well that we can take back these places and not necessarily go to the big commercial cemeteries that we often think of, and again, that becomes part of the reclamation process. So we'll have, again, a Q&A. I'll look forward to answering any questions you might have, but I really appreciate your interest, and I'm so grateful for this change that's happening. And yeah, I hope that you have what you need when you're in that moment, that those options are available to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. That's a lot to think about. Our third presenter is going to be a video. when I was talking to the funeral co-op, they said a lot of people are choosing aquamation, but they said the best people to talk about this is the Pilon Family Funeral Home in Arnprior, because that's our local aquamation provider. So what happened is that Phil Pilon of the Pilon Family Funeral Home and I did a Zoom talk and a question and answer. So this is what we're going to look at right now. Good morning. My apologies to you all. The interview with the Pilon Family Funeral Home in Arnprior is not available, and I once again apologize for this. So instead, you're going to see me walking through websites about aquamation. And I am not an expert, but I assume the websites are. So what I'm going to do is share the screen, and we will start. There. So this is the bio response solutions people who sell aquamation equipment. And so I'll just go through the beginning here. A gentle process that uses water instead of fire to return a body back to Mother Nature. And here, this is part of the green part. Over 90% energy savings when compared to flame-based. No direct emissions of harmful greenhouse gases or mercury. No burning of fossil fuels. And 20% more ash returned to the family. Now, no burning of fossil fuels. We live in Ontario where our electricity is sometimes produced from natural gas. So that, it uses electricity is what this says. And there's, quote, more people respect the planet and death. It bodes well for how they'll treat it while they're still alive. So there's the process. It's the scientific name is alkaline hydrolysis. It's the same process that occurs as part of nature's course when a body is laid to rest in the soil. It's a combination of gentle water flow, temperature, and alkalinity to accelerate the breakdown of organic materials. And this is the environmental impact. The other screen I want to share is frequently asked questions. No. Yeah. So, what is aquamation? Method of final disposition available for us and the pets. The scientific name for this is alkaline hydrolysis. and it's the same process that occurs as part of nature's course when the body is laid to rest in the soil. Combination of gentle water flow, temperature, and alkalinity. So the next question is, where is acclimation approved? It's been approved in Canada for a while. It's improved in Ontario in just fairly last few years. There are 4 sites in Ontario. There is one in Eastern Ontario, which is in Arnprior, run by the Pilon family. 3 of the sites are high temperature acclimation, and one is low temperature acclimation, which the province is not inclined to approve anymore. So there's more questions here. It's very much like any other disposal method when it comes to, of course, you can have a viewing before with a body that's embalmed or not embalmed. This is interesting. Is there a casket required? No, unlike flame cremation, a box or a casket is not used. This is because the materials do not break down in the acclimation process. Only organic materials break down. So that's what bodies are made of. So absolutely, the casket is not required, and the body would have to be removed from it before it is processed. How long does it take? So we have in Arnprior, which is accessible to us, it's they say it's a 6-hour process, 6 to 8 hours, and it takes place at 300 degrees Fahrenheit. So what actually happens? So when it's time for the process, the individual body is respectfully placed in a stainless steel vessel. Alkali is added to the process, that's potash, based on individual characteristics, weight, sex, embalming status. And the vessel fills with water. So the solution is 95% water and 5% alkali, heated to 300 degrees Fahrenheit and gently circulated for the entire length of the process. At the end of the process, the material is broken down into building blocks. There's no DNA or RNA remaining. The sterile process water is released for recycling. And it notes that our bodies are 65% water to start with, and the vessel performs a freshwater rinse for the equipment and remains. When the operator opens the door, only the inorganic bone materials remain. Here's another question. Our acclimation remains safe to handle? Yes, it's a powerful sterilization process that results in pathogen and disease-free remains. What can be done with the ashes? Well, I won't look at this, but there anything that can be done with ashes, cremation ashes or fire ashes, these ashes are slightly different, can be done. Why do you receive more flames with a creme, with acclimation? It is very gentle. I guess they say the reason is it's very gentle to the final mineral remains, which allows more ash to be present at the end of the process. And there is a comparison there. So the remains are, at the end of the process, they sort through the remains and manually and pick out any metals or mercury fillings in particular. That's what Pilon was telling us. And they crush them so that the remains and they become a powder. What happens to the water? This is a good question. Mr. Pilon told us that the city of Arnprior had a lot of water testing and made sure they approved it before they were allowed to start up. So this says the water is returned to the ecosystem via the normal wastewater treatment facility, just as all funeral homes in Canada and other parts of the world do during the embalming process. The acclimation process produces a sterile solution of amino acids, sugars, nutrients, salts, and soap in a water solution. These are the byproducts of natural composition. Now, these three questions about pacemakers, mercury being emitted to the air, and what happens with mental implants. So basically, because mercury vaporizes at a very high temperature and alkaline hydrolysis uses lower temperatures, the mercury remains intact, bound in the teeth, and these teeth are recycled through an EPA-approved dental amalgam handler. So there's no release of mercury from fillings to the environment. Metal implants. Medical implants are not destroyed. Metals are cleaned, sterilized, look brand new after the process, and they are recycled through a metal refiner. And this is how they look. This is plain cremation remnants, and this is alkaline hydrolysis remnants. And this is the comment here. Even though green burial directly uses the least amount of energy, the reclamation of metals from bodies that undergo alkaline hydrolysis more than offsets the energy gap. What is the science behind the process? This is a good one. It's a completely commonly misunderstood fact is that it's the actually water that performs the breakdown during the acclimation process, not the alkali. Hydrolysis reaction is any type of reaction where bonds are cleaved. A base is added to create an alkaline environment, which changes the behavior of the water molecules, causing them to dissociate into hydrogen and hydroxide. So then I'll go down here. Our bodies are 65% water, along with fat, protein, minerals, and carbohydrates. So the fats are reduced to salts, protein to amino acids and peptides, and carbohydrates are reduced to sugar. So now I'm going to show you pictures of the equipment. Okay, here we have the machine that does it. This is the machine sitting horizontally with the door open. When a body comes in, this is the stainless steel basket that's on a lift table. So the body gets put on there, the table goes up, and then it slides in to the metal tube. And inside the metal tube is a basket container. So you can see how it slides along these things. So then they shut the door, and then here is it operating in the tilt position, which is the one that the Pilons have. And this shows you a picture down to the very end. You can see what is left when the process is done. And that
is that?
Good. Wow, what a lot of information. So thank you to all of our presenters, and we have about 20 minutes left for a question and answer session. I will take around the mic to anyone who has a question, and Margaret will be up here, and we will call on our, Kelly, if you'd like to come up, or Judith, suit yourself, we can bring the mic to you.
Okay. So, who has a question? Okay, Carol's going to come to you with the mic.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, the question is follow-up to this presentation, and thank you, Margaret. It was great. The logistics, how does the body get from here to Arnprior? Go ahead.
Okay, Phil was telling me that the funeral co-op is his biggest user in Ottawa.
Okay.
But other funeral homes will do it. If they have a crematorium, they may not want to, but yeah.
Okay.
And do you know more about that, Kelly?
Well, you can, is this on? Can you hear me? It's on? Okay, great. You could also call the Pilon Funeral Home directly, and they would arrange for a transfer service to bring the body to them. So you can still use any funeral care provider you want, and if you're not using Pilon, the funeral home you're using would then, you'd have a charge from Pilon for the aquamation itself.
So then, at the other end, after the aquamation process, does a family member go up there to collect? Or?
Again, you'd have the choice. Either the funeral home you're working with would bring the remains back to that funeral home, like let's say you're using Tubman's or the funeral co-op, or if you wanted to go to Arnprior and pick up, you could do that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Andrew?
When my grandmother passed away, she didn't want a funeral. She wanted to donate her body to science. And so we contacted the University of Ottawa, and we were told that we could not actually donate a body to science without involvement of a funeral home. Now, that was 25 years ago. I don't know if we were told the straight goods or not, but I wonder how that works today. Can you do that without actually having to pay for even a basic funeral service?
You wouldn't have to have a funeral per se or engage the services, like the broader services of a funeral home. They may still want the funeral home to be the coordinator, because the body still needs to get from where the person has died to wherever it's going. Say it's University of Ottawa, the medical school. So that may be why they want to include the funeral home. Mary, I see you.
Excuse me, Carol. Judith has a comment on the aquamation.
Well, no, I have a comment on the aquamation, but I want to answer that one. Many medical schools require that you pay for the transportation. And so that may be why they want to involve a funeral home. And different medical schools have different requirements with regard to that. But the main thing is you have to always have a fallback position, because they only take a certain number of bodies, and the bodies have to be in a certain condition. And so when the time comes, they may say no. So if that's what you want to do, by all means, fill out the forms and find out the requirements, but make sure you have plans for what would happen if they refuse at the end.
I'll add too that it's one of the things that I appreciate about the Bereavement Authority of Ontario and the activism that's been done a lot of institutions, and I think people in general, have forgotten that if the family has every right to tend to their dead in Ontario. And so it's not illegal for you to transport a loved one, your family member. But because it's been so long since we've done that, there are often, like again, say for donating a body to science, they may have those rules in place that we need to receive that person from a transfer service or funeral home, because we just don't remember that a family can actually do that.
There are certain firms here in town that are basically just transfer services.
Yeah.
All funeral homes have to offer that basic service, and most of the what we now should call flame cremation procedures are happening on the Quebec side. Very few are happening in Ottawa, so there's lots of traffic going across the bridges, and you have to have what is called a transfer permit. So if you want to do it yourself, you have to get a permit.
You cannot, as a family member, though, transport a body.
Well, if you get the permit,
in Quebec, into Quebec.
Well, whatever.
Yeah, Quebec
I
is
think
very restrictive, and that's why the things that we're sharing apply to Ontario, but Quebec itself is very restrictive in terms of family-led care.
Yeah, maybe, and I think that it depends on when you're going to do it. The regulations change all the time.
Can I comment on that one as well? In Ontario, it is legal for a family member or friend to transport a body, but you are not allowed, if you pay somebody to do it, it has to be a funeral director.
I wanted to thank you for the answer to my question, but also have a follow-up. In my grandmother's case, she passed away at the General Hospital, and where they were going to be checking her body to see if they would take it was in the Science Center right behind the hospital. So instead of actually being able to transport her down a hallway in an elevator ourselves, we received an invoice for a funeral, and then 2/3 of it was taken off, and then we had an amount owing, and I wanted to fight it and say, we never got a funeral, so don't pretend like we did. But, in that time of grief, we let it go, but it just didn't give me a great feeling about the funeral services industry.
Yeah, there's many unfortunate stories in that regard. Yeah.
Judith would like to comment on the aquamation.
I have two quick comments on the video. One of them is with regard to what you can do with ashes. In Ontario, you are allowed to scatter ashes on public land, in water, and on private property with the consent of the property owner. But if you want to keep them intact in a container, it has to go into a cemetery.
Oh, thank you.
The other one is, he mentioned natural organic reduction. That's what's usually called human composting, and that is not currently available in Ontario, in Canada at all, as far as I know.
Yes, that chart he produced was one from the Netherlands. And actually, if you go down one more, Julia, I found that website very interesting, because there's this one, and it tells you how they calculated it. And then there's another chart about how they take, titanium, yeah. So 1/2 pound of the body is quite often metals that can be recovered, such as titanium and mercury, and they do put those back into the system.
Yeah, and that's another difference between aquamation and cremation. Cremation, that all goes into the ashes, and in aquamation, it doesn't, and they can remove joint replacements and other things that have been implanted.
And that's why in this chart there's a positive return on the total. Go, follow the website, the link at the beginning, and you'll find more. Okay, Carol, over to the questioners.
I think I'm moving to on prior. My question is, how many bodies per acre are possible for burial? Because it strikes me that if people are switching from cremation to burial, we're going to need an awful lot of land.
I don't have that number offhand. Judith, maybe you do?
I can't tell you offhand. I can tell you that land is one of the things Canada has a lot of. The other thing is that there are, at the moment, you can only put one body per grave in Canada, or in Ontario, I assume in Canada. In Europe, where they're running out of space, they do now have a provision for having several bodies in the same grave, and so they can be much more compact, but we haven't got to the point where we need that yet.
I think Elmwood Cemetery in Perth, for example, is 42 acres, and it's only 50% full, and it's been in existence since the late 1800s. So again, there's an abundance of land here. The exclusively natural burial site that is very likely on its way, this is one of the things that's being discussed, that a plot might be reused 50 years later. And in Europe, you know, it's very common, the understanding that the grave site that you purchase is temporary. You have it for a certain number of years. You know, we can think of the catacombs of France, but that whatever's left is removed at some point, and you know, oftentimes there's complete breakdown after a decade or two, but you may still have some bones left, and to rebury in the same spot may become something that we, you know, consider normal. I'll say too that that's worth noting that a lot of times we have an aversion to particular things, but it's just because it's not in our habit. So when cremation was first introduced, there was a lot of pushback because we were used to burying. And over time, you know, cremation is the most common choice at this point. Alkaline hydrolysis or aquamation has that same sort of aversion, and that's initially what we were dealing with the BAO. But over time, as we get more comfortable with it, a lot of the reasons that we might say no, we start to realize that actually maybe it's a pretty good idea.
Yeah, one reason that cremation is a lot cheaper than burial is that you don't have to buy the real estate. And real estate, as we all know, is increasingly expensive. And so, and a grave plot, because it's small, but it's still real estate.
Go for it. That's the joke, you know, bought the plot.
Right. Right.
That was my family's.
Yeah. There's also has been some discussion about stacking bodies so that you have them at several in various layers. Generally, that would be for family members.
Okay, I see there's another question there.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that I spent some time in Japan years back, and there they have like family monuments out of stone or cement, and you can open them again. And so the members are cremated, and the ashes are added, and wooden names on sticks added to that monument. So, you know, this idea of families or people being on top of each other, you know, has been there for a long time, because real estate is obviously, an issue there. For myself, I'm on my own, so what I wanted to do is to be cremated, although now I think I'll go for aquamation, and my ashes to be added to my parents' burial plot, because they were traditionally buried. And I hope that's not going to be an issue, but it's going to be in Manitoba. Does that sound like it's a big no-no? Because that's what I'm planning on or hoping for.
There wouldn't be any prohibition. Cemeteries generally will let you know that, like whatever plot you have, that there's room for 2 burials and 18 urns, or whatever the case is. So they have a little calculation in terms of what is allowed in that particular spot.
But it might be a good idea to ask the cemetery.
Okay, yeah, it gets down to the cemetery. Thank you.
Okay, there's a question over there, Carol, and then one up here.
Saw a hand here first, and then I'll come to you.
This isn't a question. I just would like Judith to repeat what she said about ashes versus, scattering ashes versus keeping them.
It is legal to scatter ashes in Ontario in water and in public land, unoccupied public land.
That being Crown land.
Crown land.
Yeah.
And in private property with the consent of the landowner. But if you want to keep them intact in a container, that container has to be buried in a cemetery.
How would they know that you're keeping these in your own home?
They don't. You can
They
keep them
don't.
at home too.
Right.
You can
yes,
keep
I know
you
lots
can
of
keep
people.
ashes.
If somebody finds it sometime later, there may be some legal issues.
Oh.
I mean, it wouldn't bother you, but...
I do want to just mention too that keeping ashes at home is fine. That's a legal option. It often is very meaningful to folks, but having a backup plan, having some kind of long-term plan is a good idea, because what I've seen, I've worked in funeral homes, a couple of moves happen and nobody remembers where grandma's ashes went. Dad gets dementia, and where's mom? And so it is something, and a lot of times that decision to have the ashes at home isn't really a decision. It's that we just don't know what to do, and so the urn stays. And so it's just to flag or to suggest that do give this some consideration, because at some point they probably need a permanent home.
And it is my understanding that the ashes from a cremation, flame cremation, are in fact toxic to trees, and you should not collect them under or scatter them under one single tree.
I'd like to know what is done with the liquid left over after the acclimation is finished. Liken it to a body in a bathtub, well, the water goes down the drain. What is done with this liquid? Does it just go?
It goes into the sanitation system. And I know a lot of people, that's one of the things that we react to, that we find kind of off-putting. But if with conventional burial, when we're embalming, the blood that is drained from the body already goes directly into the drain. Mm-hmm. And I'll remind us that we all use the toilet. So it can be a little confronting that this is what happens. As was mentioned by Phil Pilon, it's actually a really amazing fertilizer. And in some places, that's what the liquid is being used in that way. It's not allowed here in Ontario. And so yes, the liquid remains go down the drain.
There's
Last one, maybe?
one more.
I didn't see who had it.
Hi. In the days of yore, when the body was laid out in the family parlor, was the body embalmed first?
No. And so this is another thing that it's not about natural burial, but I might make this point. You are not obliged to embalm a body by the province. Funeral homes will say if you want to have a visitation, you have to have embalming. That's their rule. And so if we start saying, look, then I'm going to go somewhere else, because a lot of people want to avoid the embalming. It's a chemical process that is not actually necessary. This is one of the reasons, too, that we, as community death care, we advocate for family-led care. You can still have your person at home, maybe have a vigil, have some time with your beloved. But in the days of yore, no, the person would have been laid out. So you would have washed the body, dressed the body, laid them out, and this is what we were accustomed to.
For how long could the body be at home?
There's no actual time limit in Ontario. I assume they're resting on or expecting good judgment, but we have a cultural habit of a funeral's often 3 days after the death. I know that sometimes that's how long people will want to keep somebody at home. But I think, even if it's 12 hours, if it's a day, but there's not this, oh, it's not safe, it's dangerous. It's not the case. You might still have to contend with some of the natural processes that happen when somebody dies, but they can be dealt with, and we used to deal with them. We're not inventing something new, we're just returning to an old practice.
And dry ice is your friend.
Dry ice is your friend. There's also something called techni ice for those of you that are really, all about home funerals, which techni ice, it's the opposite of like a hot pocket or hot shot thing, that you mesh and it releases, it stays cold. So.
Given that our time is just about up, this will be our last question.
Yay. So you spoke about ashes from cremation being toxic for trees, and I understand with aquamation that the liquid is not, but it goes down the drain. What about the bones that are ground into like a flour-like substance with aquamation? Is that toxic for trees?
I don't know if I'd use the word toxic per se. It's just that they're acidic. And so in the same way that you shouldn't take the ashes from your fireplace and dump them in a big pile around a tree, it's that because of the acidity, you just want to spread it out a little bit more. So I wouldn't call it toxic per se. With the bones from alkaline hydrolysis, they haven't been, the flame process isn't part of it. They haven't been burned. So you just have that difference in pH.
Yeah. So, thank you. Great questions. Superb speakers. Yes. So thank you all for coming. And I hope you found it useful. I did. And there's an information table at the back with all sorts of things. Information pamphlets, and there's also a donation basket if you'd like to help us cover the costs for this event. So,
if I can just add as well, Community Death Care Ottawa does offer a lot of free public events on things like home funerals, shrouding, these sorts of talks. So if you pick up one of the cards and go to our website, sign up for the newsletter, you'll find out about these sorts of events on dying, death, and tending to grief.
Thank you.